Hello. My wife, Megan, and I had been married for 7 years. She was 34, I was 36, and on the surface, our life seemed picture perfect. We lived in a quiet suburb, with a house we'd spent years turning into a home. Megan had her job as a marketing manager, while I worked in IT, often from home. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said we were solid, boring, maybe, but solid. Then came the small changes. It started with her phone. Megan had always been glued to her screen, but lately, it felt different. She'd laugh at texts she wouldn't share, or tilt her phone away when I walked into the room. When I asked her about it, she'd wave me off. "It's just work stuff," she'd say, dismissive. I wanted to believe her. Megan had never given me a reason not to trust her. But as the weeks passed, those little red flags kept popping up. One Friday night, Megan told me she had to stay late at the office. That wasn't unusual, so I didn't think much of it. I made myself dinner, settled onto the couch, and flipped on a show to kill time. Around 10 p.m., I got up to grab a drink, and that's when I saw it, her car pulling into the driveway. She hadn't texted to say she was coming home, which was odd. When she walked in, she looked off. Her hair was slightly tousled, her makeup smudged, and she had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're home early," I said, trying to sound casual. She hesitated before responding. "The meeting ended sooner than expected. I didn't want to wake you." Something about the way she said it didn't sit right, but I let it go for the moment. Over the next few weeks, Megan's behavior became harder to ignore. She was spending more time at work, but whenever I tried to ask about her day, her answers were vague. She brushed me off with excuses like, "just the usual stress," or "nothing worth talking about." Our conversations dwindled, and so did the intimacy. Nights that used to be spent watching movies together or sharing our day turned into me sitting alone while she scrolled through her phone. One night, I asked her outright if something was wrong. "No," she said quickly. "Why would you think that?" "I don't know," I replied. "You just seem distant." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's just work. You're overthinking it." Maybe I was, or maybe I wasn't. Around this time, our neighbor Claire started coming into the picture more frequently. Claire was 32, married to a guy named Jason who worked long hours as a consultant. She was friendly, always quick with a smile or a wave, and we'd occasionally chat over the fence when I was out in the yard. One afternoon, while I was trimming the hedges, Claire walked over holding 2 beers. "Thought you could use a break," she said with a grin. "Thanks," I replied, taking one. We talked about the neighborhood, the weather, and eventually about our spouses. Claire mentioned how Jason was barely home these days, and I found myself opening up about Megan's late nights. "She's probably just busy," Claire said, though her tone was cautious. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm around." Over the next few weeks, I started leaning on Claire more than I should have. It wasn't intentional, at least, not at first. She was just there. Easy to talk to, sympathetic in a way Megan hadn't been in months. It didn't help that Claire had a knack for noticing things. One evening, as we stood in her backyard, she asked, "Do you ever feel like Megan's hiding something?" Her question caught me off guard. "Why do you say that?" I asked. Claire hesitated before replying. "Just little things I've noticed. The way she acts when Jason and I run into her in town, or how she always seems distracted." I didn't want to believe it, but the seed had been planted. The breaking point came one Tuesday evening. Megan had told me she'd be working late, again. I decided to take a drive to clear my head, and as I passed her office building, I saw it. Megan stepping into a sleek black car that wasn't hers. I pulled over and watched as the car drove off. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and nausea. I didn't follow them. I couldn't bring myself to, but I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. When Megan came home that night, I asked her about the car. "Oh, just a coworker giving me a ride," she said nonchalantly. "What coworker?" I pressed. Her eyes narrowed. "Why does it matter? Do you not trust me?" I didn't answer, but the silence said it all. A few days later, I ran into Claire again. She took one look at me and frowned. "You okay?" she asked. "Not really," I admitted. We sat on her porch, and I told her about the car, about Megan's excuses, about the sinking feeling in my gut. Claire listened quietly, nodding as I spoke. You know, she said after a moment, Jason's been acting weird lately too. Coming home late, being secretive. You don't think? Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. From that moment, things between Claire and me changed. We started talking more frequently, piecing together the fragments of our crumbling marriages. There was a strange comfort in it, knowing we weren't alone, that someone else understood the pain of betrayal. But as the days turned into weeks, our conversations began to shift. The focus wasn't just on our spouses anymore, it was on us. One night, after a particularly heated argument with Megan, I found myself knocking on Claire's door. She opened it, her expression soft and knowing. "Come in," she said quietly. We sat on her couch, sharing a bottle of wine and our frustrations. "Do you think they'll ever stop?" I asked, my voice heavy with resignation. "No," Claire replied, her tone bitter. "People like them never do." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence filled with unspoken possibilities. After that night at Claire's house, everything felt different. Our talks became more frequent, more intense, and less about our spouses. It wasn't that we forgot why we were leaning on each other, but there was a shift in focus. We weren't just venting anymore. We were finding solace, maybe even distraction, in one another. Meanwhile, Megan was oblivious. Her late nights continued, her excuses grew weaker, and her affection toward me felt almost performative. She'd make casual attempts at conversation, probably to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, but the effort was half-hearted at best. "How was your day?" she asked one evening as she set her bag on the counter. "Fine," I replied, not looking up from my laptop. "Good," she said, pausing for a moment before heading upstairs. That was the extent of our interaction most nights. The silence between us was deafening, and neither of us seemed interested in breaking it. Around this time, I started paying more attention to Jason. He was Claire's husband, though you'd hardly know it from how little he was around. His late nights mirrored Megan's almost perfectly, a detail Claire and I couldn't ignore. "Have you noticed how often they're both gone at the same time?" I asked her during one of our porch talks. Claire nodded, her expression tight. "Yeah, it's hard not to." We started keeping track, comparing notes on their schedules. The patterns were impossible to ignore. On nights when Megan was working late, Jason was too. When Megan had a sudden meeting, so did Jason. It was almost laughable how careless they were being. One evening, I decided to follow Megan. She told me she was heading to a late dinner with her team, and I waited until she left before grabbing my keys. I stayed a few cars behind her, careful not to get too close. She didn't head toward any restaurant I recognized. Instead, she drove to a quiet residential street and parked in front of a house. A few minutes later, Jason's car pulled up behind hers. I watched as they greeted each other with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. They didn't even glance around to see if anyone was watching before heading inside together. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and trying to decide what to do. Confront them? Take pictures? Smash Jason's car window? In the end, I drove away. I wasn't ready, not yet. When I told Claire what I'd seen, her reaction surprised me. "I knew it," she said, her voice calm but cold. "You're not angry?" I asked. "Oh, I'm furious," she replied. "But this just confirms what I already suspected." Her composure was unsettling, but I understood it. After weeks of suspicion, the truth wasn't shocking. It was just exhausting. "What do we do now?" I asked. Claire took a long sip of her wine before replying. "We make them regret it." The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Claire and I decided to confront Megan and Jason together, but not before gathering more evidence. We wanted to leave no room for denial, no chance for them to spin the situation in their favor. We started documenting everything: texts, photos, timestamps. Claire even managed to get access to Jason's phone one night while he was asleep, forwarding incriminating messages between him and Megan to herself. It was damning, all of it. As we pieced together the full scope of their affair, Claire and I grew closer. Too close. One night, as we sat on her couch poring over the evidence, our conversation drifted away from Megan and Jason. "Do you ever wonder what went wrong?" Claire asked suddenly. With them? I asked. With us, she clarified. With our marriages. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. I guess. I stopped paying attention. Maybe Megan did too. Claire nodded, her gaze distant. I feel the same way about Jason. Like we just drifted. Her words hit harder than I expected. For the first time, I saw our shared pain not as two separate experiences, but as one deeply intertwined mess. The tension between us had been building for weeks, and that night, it finally came to a head. I don't know what happens after this, Claire said quietly, but I do know one thing. What's that? I asked. They don't deserve us, she replied, her voice firm. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Neither of us moved for a moment, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the wire snapped. We kissed. It wasn't planned or even intentional. It just happened. A collision of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. For a moment, everything else faded away. Megan, Jason, the lies, the betrayal. It all felt distant, like a bad dream. But reality came rushing back as we pulled away, the weight of what we'd just done settling over us. We can't, Claire said, her voice trembling. I know, I replied, my heart pounding, but we both knew it wasn't over. After that night, everything changed. Claire and I didn't cross that line again, but the connection between us was impossible to ignore. We'd become more than allies in this mess. We were each other's escape, a way to feel seen and valued when our spouses had made us feel invisible. The confrontation with Megan and Jason loomed on the horizon, and as the day approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the fallout. The night of the confrontation arrived sooner than I expected. Claire and I had planned every detail, compiling all the evidence into a neat package that left no room for doubt or denial. It wasn't just about exposing Megan and Jason. It was about reclaiming a sense of control over the mess they had created. We decided to confront them together at Claire's house. Jason was already home, and Megan thought she was meeting him for one of their usual get-togethers. Instead, Claire and I were waiting for them. Megan walked in first, her face lighting up when she saw Jason, but her smile vanished the moment she noticed me standing in the living room. Adam, she said, her voice shaky. What are you doing here? Waiting for you, I replied coldly. Jason entered a second later, freezing in the doorway when he saw Claire. What's going on? He asked, his voice laced with panic. Claire stepped forward, her expression ice-cold. We know, Jason, about you and Megan, about all of it. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of our words hanging in the air. Then Megan tried to deflect. This is ridiculous, she said, forcing a laugh. You're making something out of nothing. Claire crossed her arms, unfazed. Really? Then maybe you can explain these. She tossed a folder onto the coffee table, its contents spilling out. Screenshots of texts, photos of their meetups, and even a hotel receipt with both their names. Megan's face turned white, while Jason stammered, I can explain. Don't bother, I interrupted. We're not here for excuses. We're here to make sure you both know exactly how badly you've screwed up. What followed was a blur of shouting and accusations. Megan tried to downplay the affair, claiming it was just a fling and didn't mean anything. Jason attempted to shift the blame onto Claire, accusing her of being distant and cold. But Claire and I didn't back down. We had all the proof we needed, and their feeble attempts to justify their actions only made them look more pathetic. You don't get to rewrite history, Claire said, her voice shaking with anger. You betrayed us, plain and simple. Own it. Jason fell silent, unable to meet her gaze. As the confrontation wound down, Megan turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears. Adam, please, she said, her voice trembling. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can move past it. I stared at her, the woman I'd once loved, and felt nothing but anger and pity. There's nothing left to fix, Megan, I said quietly. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. With that, I walked out, leaving her standing in the wreckage of our marriage. The aftermath was just as messy as I'd expected. The divorce proceedings with Megan were brutal, with her fighting for everything she could get. She painted herself as the victim, claiming I'd abandoned her and refused to work on our problems. But the evidence I had of her affair made it clear who had destroyed our marriage. In the end, she got the house, while I was left with a small apartment and a mountain of legal fees. Claire's marriage to Jason didn't survive either. From what I heard, Jason moved out within a month, though Claire never told me the details. We stayed in touch for a while, leaning on each other as we navigated the fallout of our respective relationships, but over time, the connection we'd shared began to fade. What we had wasn't sustainable. It was a product of shared pain, not genuine compatibility. We parted ways amicably, both understanding that we needed to move forward on our own. As for Megan and Jason, I don't know what happened to them, and I don't care. From what little I've heard through mutual friends, their affair didn't last long once the reality of their choices set in. Life after Megan hasn't been easy. Starting over in my mid-30s, with a failed marriage and a pile of debt, feels like climbing a mountain with no end in sight. There are days when I wonder if I could have done something differently, if I could have saved our marriage, or at least avoided the mess it became. But those thoughts don't linger. I didn't cause this. Megan did. Revenge felt good in the moment, but it didn't fix anything. The damage was already done, and all I could do was pick up the pieces and try to rebuild. Some days are better than others. But for now, I'm learning to live with the choices we all made, one day at a time. Goodbye.